The fisherman set out to sea, thinking about his usual catch. But suddenly, something heavy caught in his net. When he pulled it up, he couldn't believe his eyes. It was a real coffin, drifting in the middle of the ocean. When they opened it, the fishermen screamed in shock. What they found inside changed their lives forever. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching this vid. The sun had not yet risen above the wide horizon of the Atlantic, but already the smell of salt, smoke, and fish hung heavy in the narrow streets of the village. Wooden boats, patched and worn from years of battle in the waves, rested in the sand like tired animals. Nets were draped over fences to dry, and small children, barefoot and curious, ran along the beach chasing after stray crabs. In this quiet but harsh corner of the world lived Samuel, a man whose life was as inseparable from the sea as the tide from the shore. Samuel was known to all. His skin, dark and hardened by the sun, bore the marks of decades under the merciless sky. Deep lines cut across his face, not just from age, but from years of salt wind and sleepless nights at sea. His hands were rough, scarred by hooks, ropes, and the edges of nets, yet his movements remained calm and measured. People respected him for his work ethic and his silence. He was not a man to waste words, preferring instead to let his actions show who he was. In the village, there were always men who drank too much, laughed too loudly, or quarreled at the market. Samuel was not one of them. He walked past those scenes without judgment, as if the ocean had drained him of all petty passions. He had been born in this very place, in a hut that still stood near the shore. His father had been a fisherman, too, a tall man with a booming laugh who taught Samuel to row before he could properly walk. When Samuel was 12, his father was taken by the sea during a storm. There was no body to bury, only a broken boat that washed up days later. From that day on, Samuel understood that the ocean was both a giver and a taker of life, a companion that demanded respect. He had grown into a man with this lesson etched into his heart. His mother raised him alone after that. She had worked in the market, smoked fish, and mended nets to survive. Samuel left school early and devoted himself to fishing, not because he loved it, but because there was nothing else. The village had no factories, no opportunities, only the endless struggle with the sea. In time, he became skilled, his name associated with steady catches, with boats that returned safely even in foul weather. While others lost nets or came back empty, Samuel seemed to have an instinct for where the fish swam. The elders said it was a gift, though Samuel himself only believed it was patience. He could sit for hours in silence, watching the currents, trusting the ocean to reveal its secrets if one waited long enough. He had married once, years ago. His wife Amina had been kind, with gentle eyes and laughter that filled their small home. For a short time, Samuel's life had felt whole, as though he had finally found the family he had always missed after his father's death. They had dreamed of children, of filling the house with noise and joy, but those dreams never came true. Amina had fallen ill one rainy season, a sickness that spread through the village, and she never recovered. Samuel buried her beneath the single baobab tree near the village. Since then, he lived with only his aging mother, who spent her days sitting near the hut, weaving baskets and telling stories to neighborhood children. Samuel's life grew quieter, marked by the rhythm of tides and the unspoken weight of solitude. Yet, even in silence, there was a desire he could not bury. He longed for children, for a family of his own. Sometimes he would watch the boys helping their fathers mend nets and wonder what it might have been like to teach his own son the craft. At night, sitting by the fire outside his hut, he would hear the laughter of families drifting through the air. It filled him with warmth and bitterness in equal measure, for he had none of it himself. The ocean had given him survival, but not joy. Still, he carried on because that was all he knew how to do. The villagers admired him, but some whispered that he was too serious, too stern. They said he worked like a man possessed, as if something inside him could never rest. Perhaps they were right. Samuel rarely drank palm wine with the others, rarely joined the noisy gatherings that filled the nights with music. Instead, he mended his nets in silence, preparing for the next day at sea. When someone joked with him, he smiled politely but said little. It was not shyness, but rather the habit of a man who had been alone for too long. The ocean was his truest companion. Every dawn he pushed his boat into the waves, the wood creaking as it met the tide, and rode into the mist. He knew the water as others knew the lines of their palms. Every current, every patch of reef, every flock of seabirds meant something to him. He could tell where the fish would be simply by the way the waves moved, or by the faint silver shimmer just below the surface. Fishing was not only labor to him, it was a silent dialogue with the ocean, a conversation that only he seemed to hear. There was hardship, too. Some days he returned with barely enough to sell, enough only to feed his mother and himself. At times, storms forced him to stay ashore for days, leaving his pockets empty and his heart restless. Other men took loans, drank away their sorrows, or abandoned fishing altogether to find work in the city. Samuel stayed. He believed the ocean owed him nothing, and he owed it everything. His mother often worried. "You are growing older," she would say, her voice cracked with age. "Who will care for you when I am gone?" Samuel would only shake his head and murmur that the sea would take care of him as it always had. Yet, deep inside, he knew she was right. His life stretched before him like an endless line of tides, one day indistinguishable from the next. Without family, without children, what would be left of him when his strength failed? That morning, as he prepared his nets and checked the small wooden oars, Samuel felt the same dull heaviness he always did before setting out. The village was stirring to life around him, voices carrying through the salty air. Somewhere a rooster crowed. Children ran barefoot along the sand, chasing each other and laughing. Samuel glanced at them for a long moment. Their joy was simple, untroubled, but in his chest it stirred an ache. He tightened the knots on his net and looked out toward the horizon. Beyond that line of water lay his daily battle, and beyond it, perhaps, something else. The life he lived was one of patience and survival. Yet the sea, unpredictable as ever, was about to change everything. In the stillness of his routine, fate waited silently, ready to place upon his shoulders a burden that would test his heart in ways he could not yet imagine. He did not know it, but this ordinary dawn was the last of its kind. The ocean, which had taken his father and his wife, which had kept him alive through hunger and storms, was about to bring something back to him, something that would break the silence of his days and give shape to the longing he had carried for so many years. That morning, Samuel rode out into the gray water, unaware that his life, so steady and uneventful, was about to be torn open by a discovery stranger than anything he had ever dreamed. The sky above the Atlantic was a pale gray as Samuel rode farther from shore, the rhythmic sound of his oars breaking the silence of dawn. The village was already far behind him, no more than a smudge of dark rooftops and thin lines of smoke rising into the morning air. Out here, the world felt empty, vast and indifferent, the horizon an endless line where sea and sky met without boundary. Samuel knew this feeling well. It was both comforting and lonely, a reminder that the sea cared nothing for human troubles. It gave fish and storms an equal measure, and he accepted both without complaint. But this morning, as he pulled at the oars, he felt a strange unease. The water was unusually calm, the wind too light, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. He set his nets with practiced hands, moving with the same patience that had guided him since boyhood. The ropes slipped through his fingers, rough and damp, and the wooden floats bobbed on the surface. Usually, at this hour, seabirds hovered nearby, ready to dive once the fish rose toward the nets, but today the sky above him was almost empty. Samuel paused, leaning on the side of his boat, and scanned the horizon. Only a few gulls wheeled in the distance, far from their usual hunting ground. He frowned, but said nothing, for there was no one to hear him. The sea had its moods, and a man who lived by it had to accept them all. Hours passed, and Samuel waited. He dozed with his head resting on his arm, then woke to check the nets only to find them slack. The disappointment stung, for his mother would be waiting at home with hope for a catch to sell. He thought about rowing farther out, but the sky was growing darker, clouds gathering in slow, heavy swirls. He decided to pull the nets back in before the weather turned worse. He tugged at the rope, expecting the usual resistance of fish caught within, but instead the net pulled strangely, heavy and unyielding. His boat tilted to one side as he strained against the weight. For a moment, he thought the net had caught on a reef or a sunken log, and frustration burned in his chest. If the net tore, he would lose hours of work and perhaps the only chance at food for the day. With gritted teeth, Samuel pulled harder. The rope creaked, the boat rocked dangerously, and the water slapped against its sides. Slowly, something began to surface. He saw the outline first, a dark, rectangular shape rising from beneath the waves. His heart thudded once, hard and uneasy. As the object broke the surface fully, Samuel froze. It was not a log, not a broken piece of some old ship. It was a box, long, wooden, its sides swollen and darkened by water, its corners bound with rusted metal. His breath caught in his throat. It looked for all the world like a coffin. For a long moment he sat staring, his hands still on the rope. The sea rocked the box gently, almost mockingly, as though daring him to touch it. A chill ran down Samuel's spine. He was not a superstitious man, yet the sight of such a thing in the middle of the ocean unsettled him deeply. Where had it come from? Who had placed it here? He thought of shipwrecks, of storms dragging debris far from land, of funerals at sea. None of these explanations eased the tightness in his chest. At last, forcing himself to move, Samuel guided the coffin closer and pulled it aboard with all the strength he had left. The wood was heavy, waterlogged, and it groaned as he dragged it onto the planks of his boat. He sat back, breathless, and stared. The lid was cracked along one side, but still held shut. His instincts told him to push it back into the sea, to pretend he had never seen it. But another thought overpowered the fear. What if something, someone, was inside? The weight of that possibility pressed against him until he could no longer ignore it. With trembling hands, Samuel took the small fishing knife from his belt and slid it beneath the lid. The wood resisted at first, swollen tight, but then gave way with a splintering creak. He pushed the lid open slowly, bracing himself for whatever horror might be revealed. For a heartbeat, his mind filled with images of decay, of bones or drowned faces. But what he saw made him drop the knife and gasp aloud. Inside the coffin lay two children, a boy and a girl, pale-skinned and thin, their small bodies pressed close together. They looked no older than 10. Their clothes were simple, damp with seawater, clinging to their fragile frames. For an instant, Samuel thought they were dead, their faces waxy and still, lips colorless. His heart clenched with sorrow, but then he saw it. The faint rise and fall of their chests, the shallow whisper of breath. They were alive. A wave struck the side of the boat, jolting him back to action. He knelt quickly, lifting the boy's head first, then the girl's, searching their faces for signs of life. Their eyelids fluttered but did not open. He fumbled for his flask of water, tilting a few drops onto their lips, but they swallowed only weakly. Panic and determination wrestled inside him. He had no skill as a healer, no medicines or blankets, only the rough cloak he wore against the wind. Stripping it off, he laid it over their bodies, tucking it tightly around them to guard against the damp sea air. The coffin lay open beside him, a grotesque reminder of the sea's cruelty, but Samuel no longer cared what it meant. All that mattered were the two fragile lives before him. They were not his children, not even of his world, yet in that moment he felt an overwhelming need to protect them. He whispered a few words to steady himself, then grabbed the oars. His arms burned as he rowed, every stroke filled with urgency. The village was far, but he would reach it. He had to. The sea, which had seemed so calm earlier, began to stir, small waves slapping against the hull as if resisting him. Samuel rowed harder. His thoughts were a storm of questions he could not answer. Who were these children? How had they ended up sealed in a coffin in the open ocean? What had they endured before he found them? He had no answers, only the heavy weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Hours later, the shoreline came into view. His shoulders ached. His hands bled where the rope had cut into his skin, but he did not slow. People gathered on the beach as they saw his boat approach, drawn by the sight of the strange burden he carried. Their voices rose in shock and confusion when he lifted the two children from the boat, their pale faces ghostly against his dark arms. Questions flew at him, but Samuel did not pause to answer. He pushed through the crowd, shouting for help, for someone to fetch a cart, for someone to call the doctor in the nearby town. The villagers followed, whispering and pointing, some crossing themselves as if warding off bad luck. But Samuel did not hear them. He walked with the children cradled against him, their bodies light but unbearably precious. For the first time in many years, his heart pounded not with the rhythm of the tide, but with fear for lives not his own. He reached the waiting cart, laid the children gently down, and climbed in beside them. As the driver whipped the donkey forward, Samuel kept his hands on their small shoulders as if his touch alone could keep them in the world of the living. The road to the hospital stretched long ahead, but he would not leave them. He could not. The coffin still floated at sea, abandoned and drifting, but Samuel had already chosen his path. Whatever mystery lay behind that terrible discovery, his life had been bound to these children the moment he pulled them from the water. He did not know yet how deeply that bond would shape his days, only that nothing would ever be the same again. The wheels of the cart rattled over the uneven road as Samuel kept his eyes fixed on the two pale faces lying beside him. Their breathing was shallow, their skin damp with salt and sweat, and every jolt of the cart made his heart lurch with fear that they might slip away before reaching the doctor. The village sounds faded behind them, replaced by the steady clip-clop of the donkey's hooves and the anxious murmurs of those who had decided to follow on foot. Word had already spread like fire. Samuel had brought back two strange white children from the sea, children who seemed pulled out of death itself. Gossip clung to the air, but Samuel heard nothing except the faint breaths of the boy and girl. He held his hands lightly upon their small shoulders, as if that fragile contact could anchor them to life. The journey to the town was longer than Samuel liked to admit. Every rise and fall of the road tested his patience, and every moment that passed seemed to threaten the children's fragile hold on existence. When, at last, the simple building of the hospital came into view, Samuel felt relief wash through him so strongly that his knees almost gave way. He carried the boy first, his arms strong but careful, and then returned for the girl, who weighed almost nothing at all. Nurses came rushing, startled by the sight, but quickly ushered him inside. Within minutes, the children were on narrow beds, doctors leaning over them with sharp voices and urgent hands. Samuel stood back, suddenly useless, his heart pounding as he watched. They placed wet cloths on the children's foreheads, forced small amounts of clean water into their mouths, rubbed their arms and legs to bring warmth back into them. Words Samuel did not understand flew between the medical staff, a mixture of foreign languages and the practiced shorthand of people who had seen too many lives hang by a thread. He tried to step closer, but a nurse pushed him gently aside, telling him to wait. He obeyed, though his whole body trembled with frustration. Waiting was something he had mastered at sea, but waiting here, while two young lives flickered like weak flames in a storm, was almost unbearable. Hours seemed to pass in a blur. Samuel sat on a wooden bench in the corridor, his cloak still damp from the sea, his hands stained with salt and rope burns. Villagers who had followed gathered outside, whispering, speculating, some even crossing themselves when they heard how he had found the children in a coffin. To them, the ocean was a place of both livelihood and terror, and this discovery was a bad omen. Yet Samuel felt no fear of curses or spirits. His only fear was that he might have found the children too late. At last, a doctor approached. His face was stern, but not hopeless. He explained that the children were alive, though weak. They had suffered from dehydration, cold, and exhaustion. They would need rest, warmth, and food before their strength returned. Samuel let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, a long exhale that carried with it hours of worry. For the first time since pulling them from the coffin, he allowed himself to believe they might survive. He was permitted to see them once more. The boy lay motionless, but his color had improved. The girl stirred faintly, turning her head as though seeking light. Samuel stepped closer, resting one hand gently near hers on the blanket, though he did not dare touch her. He whispered words of comfort in his own tongue, not sure if they could hear him, but needing to say them nonetheless. Something inside him, long silent, stirred to life. He had no children of his own, yet looking at these fragile bodies, he felt the stirrings of a bond he could not name. The following days were filled with waiting. Samuel visited the hospital each morning after fishing, sometimes bringing small offerings, fruit, fresh water, once even a carved wooden toy boat. He did not know if the children would care for such things, but it felt right to give them something made by his own hands. Slowly, day by day, they improved. The girl opened her eyes first, gazing around with confusion, then fear, before closing them again to sleep. The boy took longer, but eventually stirred, his lips whispering incoherent words. Samuel was there each time, a constant presence, and though the doctors and nurses did their work, it was his face the children began to recognize. The villagers' curiosity did not fade quickly. Some came to the hospital to peek inside to see these strange children for themselves. There were murmurs of unease. Why had the sea given them to Samuel, of all people? Was it a blessing or a curse? Samuel ignored the talk. He knew only that he had pulled them from death and could not abandon them now. One evening, as the sun sank over the horizon and painted the town in deep orange, Samuel sat by their beds in silence. The girl stirred again, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak. He leaned closer, catching only a faint murmur. Her eyes flickered open, pale and wide, and for the first time they focused on him. She did not speak words he understood, but her gaze was enough. She was alive, and she knew he was the one who had carried her here. The boy awoke later that night. His first words were weak, broken, but clear enough to reveal his name. Samuel listened closely, piecing together what little he could, learning the boy was called Daniel and his sister Emma. The names felt strange on his tongue, foreign yet already familiar. He repeated them softly, and the children, even in their exhaustion, seemed to take comfort in hearing their names spoken aloud. Samuel left the hospital that night with the names of the children echoing in his mind. He looked out over the dark sea as he walked back to his village, the stars reflected in the waves. For the first time in many years, he felt something other than emptiness when he thought of the future. The ocean had always taken from him, stripping away father, wife, and joy, but now, against all expectation, it had given him something instead. Not gold or a great catch, but 2 small lives clinging to survival. The thought unsettled him as much as it comforted him. He did not know who their parents were, how they had come to be drifting alone in the coffin, or what fate awaited them once they recovered. But he knew one thing with certainty. The children were alive because of him. He had pulled them from the sea and carried them to safety, and in doing so he had tied himself to them in a way that could not easily be undone. Samuel reached his hut that night exhausted, but sleep would not come. He sat by the small fire, staring at the embers, listening to the quiet breathing of his mother inside. His heart felt heavy, yet alive with a strange, unfamiliar energy. He was a fisherman, a man who lived by the tide, but now the course of his life had shifted like a sudden current beneath his boat. He could feel it, though he did not yet know where it would lead. The days of waiting had turned into something more than hope. They had turned into responsibility, into a bond of the spirit. Samuel did not yet know what he would do when the children were strong enough to speak, when their story finally came to light. But deep within him, in a place he had not touched for years, a seed of determination had begun to grow. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Samuel no longer saw the future as an endless repetition of tides and nets. Instead, he saw 2 pale faces, fragile yet full of possibility, and he felt an ache of longing to protect them. He had rescued them from the sea, but the true rescue, he sensed, was only beginning. The first clear words Samuel heard from the boy came several days after that fragile awakening, when the fever had left their bodies and their lips no longer trembled with each breath. The hospital room was quiet, filled only with the faint sound of a ceiling fan creaking overhead and the occasional distant murmur of nurses. Samuel had taken his usual seat near their beds, his large hands resting calmly on his knees, his presence a steady anchor in the swirl of confusion the children must have felt. He did not expect them to speak, not yet, but suddenly the boy stirred and whispered a word that Samuel almost missed. He leaned forward, caught it, and repeated it softly to ensure he understood. "Daniel." The boy nodded faintly, eyes fluttering shut again. Moments later, the girl lifted her small hand toward Samuel, her pale fingers trembling as if they wanted to grasp something. He bent closer and heard her whisper, "Emma." The sound of those names sent a tremor through Samuel. For days they had been nameless, two fragile beings suspended between life and death, and now, with those words, they became real. He repeated the names again, gently, and both children seemed to find comfort in hearing them spoken. From that moment, the distance between them narrowed. They were no longer strangers pulled from the ocean. They were Daniel and Emma, and their story waited to be told. At first, their attempts to speak were halting, broken by weakness and the unfamiliarity of the place they found themselves in. Samuel sat patiently, sometimes for hours, while the children struggled to form words. When his own language failed to meet theirs, he relied on gestures, on tone, on the quiet persistence of one who had spent his life waiting for the sea to yield its gifts. Little by little, their story began to emerge, not as a single confession but as fragments, scattered memories pieced together like torn netting stitched back into shape. They spoke of a house far away, a place Samuel could only imagine from their descriptions. Tall windows with curtains that swayed in the wind, floors that echoed when footsteps fell too heavily, rooms filled with voices raised not in laughter but in quarrel. Their parents, they explained, had not always been so cruel. There had been days long ago when their father carried Daniel on his shoulders and their mother braided Emma's hair with care. But all of that had withered once the inheritance came. Samuel frowned as the children struggled to describe it, for to them it was simply money, a thing they had never seen but felt like a shadow over every corner of their lives. Daniel's voice shook as he described nights when their parents screamed at each other until the walls seemed to shake. Emma, though younger, remembered the bitterness on their mother's face, the way her eyes no longer softened when she looked at them. Instead, suspicion had taken root. Suspicion that even her own children might someday stand in the way of the fortune she wanted to control. Samuel listened with a heavy heart, for he could not imagine such poison within a family. To him, children were the greatest blessing life could offer, not rivals to be cast aside. As the days passed, the children revealed the cruel heart of the story. They had overheard their parents whispering, voices low but sharp with fear and greed. The inheritance was theirs by right, the parents said, but one day Daniel and Emma would inherit too. In their warped minds, the children had become enemies, competitors for wealth they had never asked for. Samuel clenched his fists as he listened, fighting to contain the anger rising within him. Then came the day of betrayal. Daniel spoke slowly, pausing often, his eyes distant as though the memory burned too brightly to look at directly. Their parents had taken them to the water, saying it was to be a journey, an outing on a small boat. At first, Daniel had believed them, though unease gnawed at him. Emma remembered the way her mother's hand had been cold when it pushed her into the seat, the way her father avoided looking into her eyes. They were rowed out, farther and farther until the land was a blur. Then the parents left them, claiming they would return soon, their voices brittle with false sweetness. But the parents did not return. The boat drifted, abandoned. Hours turned into days, the sun scorching their skin, the salt air burning their throats. Emma wept until her tears dried, and Daniel tried to comfort her, though he felt the same terror clawing at his insides. Their supplies were nothing, only the clothes on their backs and the cruel expanse of water around them. Samuel closed his eyes as he imagined it, his heart aching at the thought of two small children abandoned to the mercy of the sea. Then they spoke of the coffin. It had been wedged against the boat, waterlogged, drifting aimlessly, as though the ocean had carried it toward them on purpose. They had not thought of it as a coffin, not at first. To them, it was a box, wood that floated, something that could shield them from the relentless sun. Daniel, though only a child, had understood they could not survive long exposed in the open. He helped his sister climb inside, then pulled the heavy lid down just enough to cover them. It was dark, suffocating, but safer than the merciless brightness above. Their bodies gave in to exhaustion soon after. When they awoke, it was Samuel's arms that carried them out of the darkness. As they spoke, tears filled Emma's eyes, rolling silently down her pale cheeks. Daniel looked at Samuel with a mixture of shame and gratitude, as though afraid that telling the story would make him less worthy of the rescue he had received. Samuel shook his head softly and placed one broad, weathered hand on Daniel's shoulder, steady and unyielding. "No child should endure this," he murmured, though he knew they understood little of his words. They understood his voice, his presence, his vow without need for translation. The children's story spread quickly beyond the walls of the hospital. Officials came, scribbling notes, speaking in clipped voices about custody, legal guardianship, and the fate of the inheritance. To Samuel, these words were foreign, distant, and cold. He cared nothing for wealth, nor for the intricacies of law. All he saw were two children who had been betrayed by the very people who should have protected them. All he felt was the rising certainty that he had been chosen, not by fate or by law, but by the simple bond forged when he pulled them from the sea. Night after night, Samuel sat by their beds until he was sure they slept peacefully. He would return to his hut and stare at the dark waves, hearing the echo of Daniel's weak voice, Emma's trembling hands, the story of abandonment that haunted them both. He thought of his own loneliness, the empty years marked only by the rhythm of the tide, and he felt a fierce determination stir within him. He had rescued them once from the ocean's grip. Now he would rescue them again, this time from the cruel chains of the past. The telling of their story had changed everything. Samuel could no longer see them as temporary wards of chance, no longer believe his responsibility ended at the hospital door. They had been cast adrift by the ones who gave them life, and yet through some strange twist of the sea's will, they had been delivered into his hands. As he left the hospital one night, the stars spread wide above him. Samuel whispered their names again, Daniel, Emma, and knew he would never let them go. The story the children had slowly revealed weighed heavily on Samuel's heart, but what troubled him even more was the cold reality that followed. Daniel and Emma were recovering day by day, regaining their strength, their voices growing clearer, their pale faces showing hints of the life that had nearly been taken from them. Yet, outside the quiet walls of their hospital room, another storm was gathering, one made not of waves and wind, but of words, papers, and laws. Officials had already begun circling like gulls above a wounded fish, questioning, recording, making decisions that seemed to Samuel both distant and dangerous. For while the children's story was one of cruelty and betrayal, the machinery of authority moved slowly, indifferent to the simple truth that lay before their eyes. It began with the visit of a man in a pressed suit, carrying a leather case and speaking in clipped tones. He introduced himself as a representative of the social services, and though his words were polite, there was a hardness beneath them, a reminder that he did not come to comfort, but to decide. He spoke of family rights, of obligations, of the necessity of returning children to their legal guardians, unless evidence demanded otherwise. Samuel sat silently during the meeting, his dark hands folded on his knees, listening but not understanding every word. He needed no translation to feel the threat in the air. These men, with their pens and their papers, might one day send Daniel and Emma back to the very people who had abandoned them. When the children were asked about their parents, the room grew heavy. Emma clung to Samuel's arm, refusing to speak, while Daniel's eyes darkened with fear. Their silence was answer enough, but still the officials insisted on notes, on procedures. Samuel rose then, his tall frame casting a shadow across the room, and though his words were simple, the weight of his voice silenced everyone. "They cannot go back," he said, his accent thick, his English broken but clear enough to pierce the official's polished calm. "If you return them, you kill them." The weeks that followed became a battle unlike any Samuel had ever fought. He was a fisherman, a man of nets and oars, not of courts and offices, yet he found himself dragged into that world by the sheer force of his determination. Lawyers were called, evidence was collected, and a trial was arranged to decide the children's fate. Samuel had never stood before a judge, never argued before strangers in robes, but he went because he could not do otherwise. Each night he prayed in silence, not to spirits of the sea, but to the stubborn strength within himself that had carried him through storms. The court was a place of polished wood and echoing voices, nothing like the open skies and shifting tides Samuel was used to. Daniel and Emma sat quietly, their small figures dwarfed by the high benches and looming walls. Samuel stood behind them, a pillar of strength they could lean on with their eyes. Their parents had not appeared in person, but their names were spoken often, their interests defended by hired voices that spoke of misunderstandings, of temporary despair, of promises that things would be different if the children were returned. Samuel's fists clenched at those words, for he had seen the terror in Daniel's eyes, the way Emma shivered at the very mention of her mother. No wealth, no inheritance, no empty promises could erase what had been done to them. The lawyers for the children painted a different picture, one of neglect and cruelty, of greed so deep it had turned parents into executioners. They spoke of the coffin found drifting in the sea, of the doctor's reports, of Samuel's testimony. Samuel told his story plainly, without embellishment, describing the morning he pulled the box from the water, the sight of the two pale bodies inside, the fragile breaths that proved they still lived. His voice was steady, though inside he felt rage and sorrow churning like dark water. He did not care for eloquence. He only cared that the truth was heard. The proceedings stretched on longer than Samuel believed necessary. To him, the truth was simple. Children abandoned by those meant to protect them should never be returned. But the court demanded evidence, documents, witnesses. Each day he returned home exhausted, his body craving the simplicity of the sea, yet his heart knowing he could not retreat. The fight was no longer about nets and survival. It was about justice, about ensuring that Daniel and Emma would never again face the cruelty of those who had given them life, only to cast them aside. At last, the decision came. The judge's voice echoed in the chamber as he declared the parents unfit, stripped of their rights. The inheritance was frozen, to be kept until Daniel and Emma came of age, divided equally between them. Samuel felt a wave of relief sweep through him, so strong he had to steady himself with one hand against the bench. He glanced at the children, saw the way Emma's small fingers tightened around Daniel's hand, the way their eyes widened as though a weight had been lifted from them. They did not fully understand the words spoken, but they felt the change in the air. For the first time since their nightmare began, they were free of the shadow that had hung over them. The court dismissed the case, and the officials packed their papers away, their interest already moving to other matters. But for Samuel, this was not the end. He knew that laws could strip rights and freeze wealth, but they could not give children what they most needed: safety, love, and a home. As they stepped out into the sunlight together, Daniel and Emma holding tightly to his arms, he understood that his struggle was not over. He had fought the sea to bring them to shore, and he had fought the law to keep them from harm. Now he would fight for something even greater: the chance to give them a family. That night, back in his village, Samuel sat by the fire as the children slept in his hut, their breath soft and even in the quiet. His mother, frail and bent with age, watched him silently before speaking. "You have carried the weight of loneliness for many years," she said softly. "Now the sea has given you a new burden, but also a gift. Do not turn from it." Samuel looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight, and nodded slowly. He had already made his choice. Whatever hardships lay ahead, Daniel and Emma would not face them alone. He would stand for them, fight for them, and raise them as his own. The ocean had tested him in many ways, had taken much from him, and left him scarred by loss. Yet now, against all reason, it had placed two fragile lives in his care. The struggle for their fate was not just a battle in the court, but a battle within his own soul, one he had won by refusing to let despair dictate his path. As the flames flickered low and the night deepened, Samuel felt something he had not felt in many years: a quiet, steady hope, born not of the sea's bounty, but of the bond that tied him to the children he had rescued. The days after the court's decision unfolded with a quiet intensity that Samuel had never known. For years his life had been measured by the rhythm of tides, the casting of nets, the slow endurance of days that differed little from one another. Now, every morning when he opened his eyes, he was reminded that things had changed forever. The children were with him, not as temporary guests whose presence would soon be taken away, but as part of his life. Their small voices filled his hut, their uncertain footsteps echoed on the packed earth floor, and for the first time in decades, Samuel did not feel the heavy weight of emptiness pressing down upon him. At first, Daniel and Emma moved through the days like shadows, cautious and hesitant. The journey into the village had been overwhelming for them. The people who had gathered to stare at their pale faces, the whispers that followed them, the strangeness of the huts and the smells of smoked fish and wood fires, all of it left them uneasy. They clung to Samuel's presence as though it were the only anchor they had in this unfamiliar world. Emma, in particular, often slipped her hand into his, silent but seeking reassurance. Daniel tried to appear braver, standing close to his new guardian, but with his chin lifted slightly, as if he wished to shield his sister from the gazes around them. Samuel said little, but he was always near, his solid frame a wall between the children and the uncertainty of the crowd. In the evenings, Samuel's mother would prepare food, simple dishes of rice, beans, and fish, and the children would watch her with wide eyes, hesitant to eat at first. Samuel remembered their weakness in the hospital, how they had clung to life by the thinnest thread, and now he urged them gently, coaxing them with patient words until they tasted what was offered. Slowly, their trust grew. Emma began to smile faintly when Samuel's mother brushed her hair with an old comb, and Daniel started asking questions, pointing at the nets, the boats, the strange tools that filled Samuel's hut. It was as if curiosity had finally begun to break through the shell of fear they carried. Life in the village was not easy for them. The other children, dark-skinned and quick-tongued, sometimes gathered at a distance to whisper and laugh at the two pale strangers. Their clothes were different, their language awkward, their very presence a reminder of the world beyond the village. Samuel noticed the way Daniel stiffened under their stares, the way Emma lowered her eyes and pressed closer to him. At night, when the children lay on the mats Samuel had prepared for them, he sat outside by the fire and wondered how to ease their burden. He knew what it was to feel apart, to live with a weight no one else carried. He would not let them grow up believing they were unwanted. Samuel began to teach them the rhythm of his days. At dawn, he woke them gently, guiding them down to the shore where his boat waited. At first, he kept them close, letting them watch as he mended nets, explained the shifting currents, pointed to the patterns of birds that revealed where the fish swam. Daniel was quick to learn, his eyes sharp and eager, though his small hands fumbled clumsily with the heavy ropes. Emma was quieter, watching more than doing, but she often surprised Samuel with questions that revealed how closely she observed everything around her. Little by little, they became part of his work, carrying baskets, untangling knots, splashing their feet in the surf as they waited for him to row in with the day's catch. It was not only the sea that bound them closer. Samuel discovered the quiet joy of returning home with them, sharing meals, hearing their laughter when they played near the hut. Emma took to following his mother, watching her prepare food or weave baskets, learning the tasks of the household. Daniel, restless and energetic, often tried to prove his strength by lifting tools too heavy for him or running ahead to the market, only to return with a sheepish grin when Samuel caught up to him. These small moments stitched themselves into the fabric of their days, and soon it was difficult for Samuel to remember the silence that had filled his home before their arrival. The village, too, began to change in its regard for the children. At first, suspicion lingered, whispers of curses or bad omens, but as weeks turned into months, people saw the way Daniel and Emma worked alongside Samuel, the way they laughed and grew stronger, the way Samuel's stern face softened when they called him to join their games. Slowly, the mistrust faded. Neighbors began to greet the children with cautious smiles, offering fruit or small tokens at the market. Other children, once hesitant, began to include them in their play. It was not immediate, but with time, Daniel and Emma found themselves less isolated, their laughter blending with the laughter of others as they raced along the shore or splashed in the shallow water. The moment that sealed the change in Samuel's heart came one evening as the sun dipped low over the horizon. They had returned from a day at sea, tired but content. Samuel's hands were rough from the oars, his back sore from the weight of the nets, but he felt lighter than he had in years. As they ate their simple supper, Emma leaned against his arm, her small body warm beside him, and Daniel, with a grin that reminded Samuel of the boy he had once been, said softly, "Papa." The word hung in the air, fragile and full of meaning. Emma repeated it a moment later, her voice no louder than a whisper. Samuel froze, his throat tightening, his eyes burning with unexpected tears. He had dreamed of such a moment long ago, when his wife was alive, when he thought children would come naturally into his life. That dream had died with her, leaving only silence. But now, across the years of loneliness, it returned to him in the voices of these children who had lost so much, yet found enough trust in him to call him father. He did not answer at once, afraid that if he spoke, the moment might shatter. Instead, he pulled them close, resting his hand gently on their heads, and let the firelight flicker across their faces. In that moment, he understood that the sea had not only tested him, but had also given him a gift greater than any he had ever imagined. He was no longer just Samuel the fisherman, solitary and silent. He was a father, and Daniel and Emma were his children. From then on, his days were filled not only with the demands of fishing, but with the steady work of raising a family. He worried about their schooling, about the language they needed to learn, about the memories of betrayal that sometimes haunted their dreams. He rose earlier, worked harder, saved more, determined to give them everything he could. There were nights when Emma woke crying, trembling from nightmares of the coffin and the endless sea, and Samuel sat beside her until she slept again. There were days when Daniel grew angry, restless with the weight of his past, and Samuel guided him with patience, teaching him that strength was not in anger, but in endurance. Through all of it, Samuel never wavered. The children had been placed in his hands, and he would not fail them. The sea had given him many trials, had taken much from him, but it had also given him this second chance. He would honor it. And as the months turned to years, and the children grew taller, stronger, and surer, the bond between them deepened until it was no longer a question of adoption or guardianship. It was family, forged not by blood, but by the unyielding will of a man who refused to let two abandoned souls drift away into darkness. The village came to see it too. Where once they had looked at Samuel as a solitary figure, now they saw him walking with two children by his side, their laughter bright against the sound of the waves. Where once his hut had been a place of silence, now it was filled with the sounds of life. And though Samuel knew the path ahead would not be free of hardship, he no longer faced it alone. He had a family, and that made every struggle worthwhile. Time passed, not quickly, but steadily, as it always does in places where days are measured by the rise of the tide and the setting of the sun. For Samuel, the months flowed into years, yet for the first time in his life they were not empty repetitions of the same struggle. Each day carried meaning now, shaped by the voices and laughter of Daniel and Emma. The children had grown since that first terrible morning when he had pulled them from the coffin in the sea. Their limbs, once thin and fragile, had become stronger, their eyes brighter, their steps more confident. They still bore the shadows of their past, but they were no longer defined by them. In the village, they were no longer strangers. They were simply Samuel's children, and the people who once whispered behind their backs now greeted them as part of the community. It was not an easy transformation. At first, the children had moved through the village with a cautious reserve, wary of every glance, every unfamiliar sound. But Samuel's quiet strength, his constant presence, had taught them that they belonged. When other children invited them to join in games by the shore, Daniel hesitated, protective of his sister, but Emma's laughter soon drew him in. Their pale faces stood out among the crowd, yet in time it no longer mattered. They learned the local tongue, first through halting words and laughter-filled mistakes, later with fluency that surprised even Samuel. Emma helped Samuel's mother with cooking and weaving, and Daniel became eager to take his place beside Samuel in the boat, rowing with arms that grew steadier each season. The village accepted them slowly, not because they forgot their origins, but because they saw the change in Samuel himself. The solitary man who had once walked alone now walked with two children clinging to his arms. His stern face softened when they called for him. His tired shoulders straightened with pride when they ran ahead laughing. For years, people had pitied him for his loneliness, whispering about his bad luck, his losses, his silent grief. Now they watched him with respect, for it was clear he had not only saved 2 abandoned lives, but had found in them the very thing he had been denied: a family. Samuel himself felt the change most keenly in the quiet moments. There were evenings when he sat outside his hut, the fire crackling low, his mother asleep inside, and the children lying close together on their mats, whispering to each other before drifting into slumber. He would sit and listen to the sound of their voices, the rustle of their movements, and feel a fullness in his chest that he had never known before. Once he had sat in that same place listening only to the crash of waves and the lonely call of night birds. Now the silence of his past seemed like another life. He had thought himself condemned to solitude, but the sea had given him something he did not dare to hope for. Yet, even with this newfound joy, Samuel did not forget the struggles the children had endured. There were nights when Emma woke crying, trembling from dreams of the coffin and the endless water. There were days when Daniel grew restless, anger flashing in his eyes as he remembered the betrayal of his parents. Samuel did not shy away from these shadows. He sat with Emma until she slept again, whispering comfort she might not understand in words, but understood in tone. He guided Daniel with patience, teaching him to channel his strength into work, into resilience, showing him that a man's worth was not in anger, but in what he chose to protect. Slowly, the children learned to carry their past not as a wound that consumed them, but as a weight they could endure, a weight made lighter by the family they now had. As the seasons turned, Daniel and Emma began to dream again, something Samuel had feared they might never do. Daniel spoke of building his own boat one day, of fishing not just to survive, but to provide for others. Emma, more quiet but no less determined, began to speak of teaching, of helping other children who felt alone. Samuel listened to these dreams with pride, though he knew the road ahead would not be easy. He worked harder than ever, saving what little he could, determined to give them the chance to make those dreams real. The greatest proof of their belonging came not in words, but in the small, ordinary moments that stitched their lives together. Samuel remembered one evening vividly. They had returned from the sea, their catch modest but enough. The children carried the baskets to the hut, their laughter bright, their faces flushed from the sun. As they sat to eat, Emma leaned against him, tired but content, and Daniel grinned as he recounted some small triumph with the nets. In that moment, Samuel felt a surge of gratitude so strong it almost overwhelmed him. He looked at them and knew that no wealth, no inheritance, no victory at sea could compare to the simple gift of hearing them call him Father. The village no longer saw Samuel as the lonely fisherman. They saw him as a man reborn, carrying himself with a quiet dignity that came not from riches or power, but from love. The elders, who once muttered about curses and omens, now nodded in approval when Samuel passed. Children, who once mocked Daniel and Emma, now played with them as equals. The community that had once been wary now embraced them, for they saw in the children's smiles the undeniable truth of belonging. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and painted the water gold, Samuel took Daniel and Emma out in the boat. The ocean lay calm, the waves gentle, as though it too recognized the peace that had settled over their lives. Samuel rowed slowly, letting the children take turns with the oars, guiding them with patient words. Daniel's strokes were strong, though unsteady, while Emma laughed at her own clumsiness, her small hands gripping the wood with determination. Samuel watched them with quiet pride, his heart swelling as he realized how far they had come. As the boat drifted, Samuel let the oars rest and looked at the children beside him. They leaned together, gazing at the endless horizon, their faces touched by the last light of the day. In that stillness, Samuel felt the weight of his life's journey settle within him. He had lost much, endured much, and for years had believed the sea would only ever take from him. Yet here he was, with two children who had survived betrayal and despair, who now laughed and dreamed and called him father. The ocean had tested him, but it had also redeemed him. He reached out and placed his hands gently on their shoulders, steady and firm. Daniel looked up at him with the fierce loyalty of a boy who had found someone to believe in. Emma leaned closer, her small hand slipping into his. Samuel smiled, a rare, unguarded smile, and for the first time in many years he felt not just hope but certainty. The future was not empty. It was filled with the lives of these children, with the promise of days yet to come, with the simple but profound truth that he was no longer alone. The boat drifted on the golden water, the horizon wide and endless before them. The sun sank slowly into the sea, and with it the last remnants of Samuel's solitude. In its place rose something far greater than he had ever dared to dream. He had a family, not born of blood, but bound by choice and love, and with them he knew he could face whatever storms might come. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next unbelievable story. Want more shocking twists like this one? Click on the next video right now and dive into another tale that will leave you speechless. And if this story moved you, share it with your friends and family. Let them feel the same chills you did.